Good evening, Mr. Conor Ryan. How are we doing?
Hello, how are you getting on?
Not too bad at all. How are you doing?
Superb. All the better for seeing you and being able to have an excuse to drink a little whiskey on a Thursday evening.
There's hardly ever need of an excuse. You locked away, are you? Or you kept well?
I'm kept well, kept busy. Family keeps me busy. The work keeps me busy. Trying to stay up to date with what's going on in the whiskey world keeps me busy. So yeah, it's all good.
Well, that's good to hear. Well, I suppose welcome to everyone who's tuning in to another episode of Potstilled Live. I am delighted to be joined this evening by Mr. Conor Ryan. I believe you're tuning in from Kinsale.
I am. It was a sunny Kinsale, then it was cloudy. Now I think it's going to rain, but the ever-changing weather of Ireland.
So I was going to say, pretty similar to Dublin. Then we've been pretty much all seasons today, which is I had a woolly hat and a scarf on earlier on, which is unusual for winter or for summer, should I say? But sure, look, a bit of Ireland never never anybody. A few people
just had the driest May since 1850 or something like that, so I don't think we can complain too much.
Exactly, potato blight's gone and everything. Few people checking in already, saying hi. Brian Holland, aka Frenchie, have his excuse to open Dingle Batch 5 tonight. And that is right, because tonight's episode is sponsored by Dingle Distillery. Yes, Conor, you've got it there. I've got it behind me here. So this is the Batch 5 single malt. So we'll get into that in a moment. But then Paul Kavanagh dropping in to say hi to the two of us. Good evening, Paul. I hope you have a Taoscán in hand. Dennis Hendricks in the Netherlands, always ready for a bit of Irish whiskey chat. That's great to hear. And Eric joining us again from Belgium. So delighted to say hi from Belgium. Belgium getting more and more Irish whiskies these days. So that's always good to see. So yeah, we'll be talking a little bit about, I suppose, the Irish whiskey news that's going on at the moment. There's loads going on, which is great. But I suppose the main first and foremost thing I want to talk about is this Dingle Batch 5, because they are the sponsors of the show for this evening. And that is what we have in our glass at the moment. I presume you have your glass pre-poured beside you somewhere there, Conor?
There's no, I don't, because there's nothing like just popping the cork and having a little pour.
See, I've cheated. I've gone into a nice Dingle. I don't even know what you call this. It's not a Peated, almost a tulip glass.
It's kind of like a grappa glass meets. It's a beautiful liqueur glass, yeah.
And that's the Dingle Batch 5. Yeah, I was having a little go of it earlier, and I was quite enjoying it. It's definitely a good nosing glass. But yeah, so I suppose the Dingle Single Malt Batch 5. It's 3 different casks, 45% bourbon, 45% PX, and 10% Madeira. So a kind of a new maturation style for Dingle. I know that the Dingle guys are quite interesting because they don't do finishes. So everything in the Madeira is wholly matured in the Madeira and the PX and the bourbon, and then kind of vatted at the end. And I think I see Dave Cummins from Dingle has just dropped in. But I think if I'm right in saying that this was the new master distiller, Graham Coole's first single malt with the distillery. I think he did the pot still first and then released the single malt. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that there, Conor? Your nice Dingle glass in front of you.
Another gorgeous whiskey from Dingle. I've always admired Dingle's whiskey. I've always admired Dingle's approach to whiskey. Obviously being one of the first of the new wave of distillers coming on. It's always fantastic to be able to get into the flavor journey of a distillery, trying it from batch 1 all the way up now to batch 5, which is very exciting. You mentioned the quantities and the batch 5 being out, and I actually noticed from the notes that there's still only 500 of the cask strength going to be available. So there'll be 5, there'll be haggling, there'll be all sorts going to get that coveted cask strength. I even remember offering you batch 1 cask strength to buy a car off you before. It was almost like the whiskey Bitcoin of its time. And you hesitated for a moment or two when I offered you the cask 1 Dingle for your car.
Had to take a double take. As I said, that to earlier on, that Dave Cummins from the Porterhouse Group and Dingle has joined in us. There was a quick question in from Dennis in the Netherlands. He's saying that, well, I suppose not a quick question, but they don't have batch 5 yet in the Netherlands. Obviously, kind of a new release whiskey. If you're in the comments when you'll perhaps be seeing it across continental Europe, we'll be able to give a little shout out to that as well, because the decent sized batch, 36,000 bottles. I think now I can be correct on this. I think it was about 9,000 heading to the States, and then the rest was going to kind of the rest of the world and Ireland, with 500 of the, as you said, the single or the cask strength bottlings, and reasonable enough, 70 quid. I'm pretty happy with that.
Absolutely. No age statement, loads of flavour. As soon as you pop the cork, you know you're drinking a malt whiskey. Still very malt whiskey on the nose, along with all the sweeter tones from the barrel combinations. Delicious, spicy, raisiny, fruity, lovely drop.
Now we have Dave Cummins dropping back in. He said it should be making its way across the Netherlands soon. Shipments got held up with COVID, so that's very fair. And weird things get held up with COVID, like things you never think of, like with whiskey releases, the paper stock and foil stock has been held up. And
there was 6 weeks extra got thrown on to any new label anybody wanted to do.
Yeah, madness.
You get the paper.
Yeah, that's the things you don't think about, you know.
You do.
But yeah. So as we said, we are going to be, I suppose, going through Irish whiskey news and the goings on in the industry right now. And one of the things we wanted to talk about tonight, we thought was quite exciting, and very much invite people to engage, especially in this part. But we, I suppose, PhD candidate and author and all-round mate and whiskey enthusiast Fionnán O'Connor has discovered what he believes is the earliest recorded use of the words Uisce Beatha in reference to whiskey. So I suppose it's probably a good time to invite him onto the show, because by God, he's going to do a much better job at explaining this than I would. So Fionnán, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Here we're as usual, chasing behind a bunch. I only have batch 4, so good historical nod right from the get-go. But batch 4 is lovely. But anyway, speaking of being behind the times, the thought struck me a while ago about, we all repeat ad nauseum that whiskey is an Anglicization of Uisce Beatha, but when did the actual word or the phrase Uisce Beatha appear? And a lot of the records that we cite, we're talking about the history of records, are records in English, because they're the most readily available. And written literature in Irish is enormous. It's massive. Largest vernacular literature after the fall of Rome. I was thinking, Jesus, fuck, there must be stuff there. And a lot of the really early stuff is in Latin, like the Red Book of Ossory is not about whiskey per se, it's about medical alcohol, and it uses the phrase aqua vita. It's really about distilling. So after a bit of digging, I'm pretty sure I've got it. I stand to be corrected, because of course things are always out there, but it certainly is something that I was amazed that the industry doesn't know. So I can send it on to you, the picture. I have the images on the laptop.
Yeah, perhaps
it was amazing.
On the paper later.
Yeah, grand. But and of course it's in what's called Irish unseal or half unseal, which is the weirdy pub font that we kind of used to write in. That stuff is properly unsealed. So it's that, and written really small and illuminated. So it's really difficult to read. But if you know it says Uisce Beatha, you can say, all right, yeah, that makes sense. But anyway, bit of background. So I suppose the first record of distilling in Ireland is the Red Book of Ossory, which a lot of us know. But the Red Book of Ossory is not unique. It's not again, it's not really about whiskey, but it's also more to do with European science, really, as is, distilling in general. So when we talk about distilling, and I think this is where a lot of people get confused, alcohol, originally, alcohol means all kinds of things, some of which weren't distilled, just purified through a filter of some kind. When we're talking about ethanol, we're talking about, alcohol is a low boiling compound. It takes a very advanced form of distillation, very slow distillation. It's not just a blunt heat, cool, little pot with an arm. When you really start doing that intentionally, you're talking about serpentum, coiled worm coils. For the most part, there's other ways of doing it, but in Europe, that's where you start seeing people making booze, booze to drink. And that really starts happening after the year 1000, kind of 1000 to 1300, around 1100 in particular. And it starts happening in medical schools. So the big one is called Salerno, which was founded outside the back of a monastery in Italy, Montpellier in the south of France, and then Bologna, also in Italy. And the head of medicine at Bologna was a guy named Taddeo Alderotti, or Thaddeus Fiorentinus. And he wrote a book called Considia Medicalia, where he talked about serpentum, what we would call a worm coil, and what a great idea it is. And this is really going to allow you to actually separate ethanol without blowing your brains out with, other stuff, and get it in concentrated forms. So that book is the Red Book of Oxford, is basically, or the distilling bit is basically word for word, or almost word for word, a very clear copy of what was being written in Italy, and it's shoved into this Irish book of hymns. So again, like a link to medicine, but of course there it says aqua vita. And then I started looking around, and I found this fellow. He's passed on, or I would have loved to have spoken to him. I think he died in the 90s, but he was a medievalist at Trinity, a guy named Michal O'Crahur, no relation, and he spent his last 5 years just compiling. I mean, there's loads of manuscripts there that haven't been, indexed or anything. They're just sitting there, and he was looking at a lot of them and putting them in order. And I found an essay by him on that indexing, and this stuff was there. And I thought, hold on, this is distilling. He was talking about rose water, and then eventually it landed to the oldest one they have is a record from the 15th century, 1415, by a scribe named Tycho Kling. And it was what's called a Materia Medica, which would have been like a doctor's primer. Like if you were going to be a doctor, this was the kind of stuff you need to know from Arabic learning, from classical learning, from contemporary learning. And there's Alderotti again, but this time in Irish. So it's literally the Red Book of Ossory, but not translated from Ossory, but from another source, and Oscoelga. Oftentimes when we talk about the history of whiskey, the first phrases that come up are, the fun story about the annals of Clon MacNoise in 1405, Richie McGraniel drinking himself to death at Christmas. But actually, that's not from 1405. The annals of Clon MacNoise actually don't exist anymore. They exist in a 1627 translation of a presumed Irish original. The original's gone. And there's another annal which never gets mentioned, which is called the Anala Connachta, which is in Irish and is in the original and says essentially the same thing, but in Irish instead of in English. So that's earlier, but that's still not 1405 because they were annals, they're records of years. So after 1405 comes 1406, 1407, so forth. So they're actually from the 1500s as well. So it was actually a big shock after all this, like looking at stuff that isn't really when it says it's written or whatever, to find something that was Uisce Baha, and to see there the phrase, the first, there's other ambiguous stuff out there, words like Uisce and Whiskey Bay and this and that sound like they might be whiskey, or you see terms like strong waters or whatever, but to finally see unambiguously Uisce Baha, some scribe had written it down, and that link, and then you get, and of course they're talking about medical alcohol too, but it's where this origin comes from. And then to make things even more fascinating, I started tracking O'Crahur's footnotes back to their sources and ended up in the National Library of Scotland. And sometimes when you hear whiskey enthusiasts, writers, historians in Scotland talk about Scotch whiskey, this family come up called the Beatons, the Macvehas, who were physicians brought over to the Hebrides, were run by a group called the Lords of the Isles, the Rian Scal, and they had their headquarters on Islay, on Finlagan Castle. And there's a headstone there for the Beatons as well, out on Islay, out close to Kilcoman Distillery. And these would have been their hereditary physicians brought over from Ulster. And the story often told is that they brought whiskey with them. Now, that's probably not true. It's probably more complicated, where there were links of knowledge going back and forth, and these things traveled up and down. It wasn't like a Macveha brought a pot of Uisce Baha one day and that was the end of it. It was channels of dissemination of knowledge. But I found the same bloody thing appearing a century later in the Beaton libraries in the Isle of Mull, actually. And you start seeing, hold on, you have this Irish text. All this stuff is from this Italian source. Red Book of Ossory is just blatant copy. Then you have versions to lesser or higher degrees of accuracy. One is in Irish, then a version of the Irish one is cropping up in Scotland. And then what makes it really weird, those medical records become vaguer and vaguer, because when we look at the first ones, it says Uisce Baha, and we know, okay, that's just Irish for aqua vita. They mean the exact same thing that was meant in Ossory or in Italy. And then you start seeing like folk remedies using the same phrase later on. And 100 years on, it's very clear that they're talking about whiskey. They're no longer talking about medical alcohol. And to see that link, not just between the word whiskey and its roots and its beginnings, but also between Ireland and Scotland and between both of them in Europe, and to see that in a form that I think the industry, if anyone out there has seen it before me, I think the industry doesn't know it's there, and it's down the road, sitting in a library. Thankfully, there's it's relatively easy to get images from Trinity. So I have all that stuff on a laptop if anyone wants to see it. It looks really cool, like the page is eaten away in the middle and whatnot. But anyway, that was what my lockdown looked like, was staring at digitalizations of very, very small script of very, very, very dated Irish looking for Uisce Baha.
Well, in fairness, Fanon, there was a point at which I was searching for names in birth and marriage records from the 1800s in Ireland, in old Victorian cursive handwriting, and you did come in great help identifying some of those. So listen, people tell you it's not a skill worth having, they're lying. One of the things someone brought up before as well, so the Taoscán scripts, they're, what do you say, 1415?
1415, yeah.
And the I suppose, ignoring the translation of the Annals of Clonmacnoise, they're at a later date already, even though they're in a different language.
Correct. So both Clonmacnoise and the Annals of Connacht, which are essentially the same thing, and were probably copied off the same, we don't have the original Clonmacnoise in Irish, but even the translation is so similar to the Annals of Connacht that the original Clonmacnoise was probably also copied off of a similar source. One was either copied off the other, or they were both copied from something else. And that the Annals of Connacht and the Annals of Clonmacnoise trace up to like 1556. So yes, there's 1405 in there, but they were actually written much later as a history more than anything. And there's all kinds of batshit stuff in the Annals of Clonmacnoise. You should take it with a grain of salt. There's like this bit where there's a flying ship, and then somebody falls out of the sky and like is drowning in the monastery, and they have an anchor, and he has to go back up to the ship, and then it flies away. So, it's some of this stuff is not exactly foolproof in terms of historical veracity. But yeah, so the Taoscán thing was cool because that's just medical textbook. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just
Paul Kavanagh's dropped in, say he'd love to see the content. At any chance, I might do a blog post. We've previously talked about this, and I'm just waiting on some permissions from the Libraries of Ireland to be allowed to use those images. So once we get those, then I think the two of us, yourself and myself, are going to kind of clash heads on that one and come up with something. So, I mean, that's super interesting information, and love the fact that it's just sitting in Trinity, kind of almost undocumented at that point. But that is and is it spelled the way we would spell it, not spelled the Scottish?
It's actually spelled it's not technically Old Irish, but it is dated Irish, so it's like Uisci and then Beathad, Beathad. So it's neither, it's like dated Irish. But actually, the Scots spelling is the older Irish spelling. That's the spelling reform for you. But in this one instance, they're spelling it correctly. It's Uisce. That was us in the. Actually, if you look at older Irish stuff, even from like the 50s, the Irish Potstilled Distillers Association use Uisce, basically.
You won't be able to see particularly, but there's an old Tullamore crock up there from B. Daly's in the 40s, and it has Uisce spelled that way. And actually, the crocks I love from Tullamore because they, depending on who owns the company, the spelling changes as it goes along. So it starts one way, goes to another, goes back, goes off again. Yeah, I mean that's super interesting for, I suppose, some nice what do you say? Taking ownership of our national spirit, and also nice to kind of twist the screw on the Scots a little bit on the who invented whiskey. And you have some other, I mean, unrelated to that topic, but you had some interesting findings recently, I believe, just in your PhD study. I know you were saying that there's of the percentage of malt in Ireland. Or malt produced in Ireland, you were looking at very small numbers, and I believe in the 1840s, all peated or all malt whiskey was peated at some degree.
Yeah, that was a big. Actually, you know what happened there was Noel Sweeney gave me a call, and he was said, "Do you have any precedents for Irish peated malt?" And that just got me going through stuff that I kind of had a vague idea was related. And then suddenly, it comes up. So there used to be something called the malt drawbacks. So like there was malt tax, and you paid tax on malt, and we all know that. But there was also an effort to try and coerce Irish pot still distillers to making malt so that it could be taxed. And said, look, if you use all malt, you get some of the tax back. If it's mostly malt, you get nothing back. You have to be doing all malt. And we have to be able to walk in and see that you're doing it. And it completely backfired, didn't work, anyway, it just drove down the malt because there's no median like promotion for people using high amounts of malt. You did one or the other. And I found a debate in the 1840s about getting rid of the malt tax, they eventually did get rid of the malt tax, but getting rid of the drawback. And at that time, and certainly before, that was the kind of twilight of, say, like golden age poaching, when poaching was a serious threat to illicit whiskey, or to legal whiskey. Would have been like 1750 to 1850. It was really gone by the famine. But during that original block, poaching was essentially peated new make. It was a barley and oat based distillate. And then as the legal whiskey got better, poaching was kind of eroded by sugary adjuncts and whatnot, and became much more ambiguous. But every source about the original, the good poaching anyway, essentially points to something like an Islay malt. Everyone says it's very smoky, and it's made of malt, malted oats as well as malted barley, but a single malt, but not quite what we would call a single malt. But anyway, I found this debate, and they're saying, look, getting rid of the malt drawback will do this, or it won't do that, or whatever. And then they start talking about where the malt is made. And my findings, even well before then, early 1800s, had indicated that almost exclusively single malt whiskey in Ireland was made north of Dundalk. It was Ulster, you know, and the fringes around, you know, and all of it more or less was peated, which it would be. You know, pot still was an industrialized product, and industrialization came with closed iron kilns and whatnot. And malt was, as much as it did exist, was an Ulster cottage industry, and of course, you know, the same exact logic that happened in Scotland. And the debate is saying, well, look, the only thing that can compete with poaching is malt whiskey because it tastes peated. It's all universally peated, and poaching is peated. And people who like that peaty taste in poaching, they'll drink our malt whiskey because it too is peated. Holy shit! It's adamant proof that like historical Irish malt whiskey, more or less, was all smoked, and that, you know, and of course, like Bushmills and whatnot, as we know, was smoked earlier in the 20th century. You know, so that was a big shocker. So, you know, malt whiskey, if we're being very, very honest, made up about 1 to 2% of production. In the 1820s, it made about 2%. In the late 1800s and the 1880s, it made about 5%. So very slim. Now we're talking legal malt whiskey. It was bucket loads of illegal malt poaching. But anyway, what was there was heavily concentrated in Ulster. And that's very easy to track because, again, those same rebates, if you made malt alone, you got tax kickbacks. And they're all in places like Tyrone, Donegal, especially, Derry, Antrim, Down. Donegal was the poaching capital. And the Inishowen Peninsula in particular got used to describe poaching, but very, 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 very good malt peated poaching. And a lot of Ulster legal distilleries referred casually to their product as Inishowen. And again, they're talking about peated malt in the same way, like in Scotch, Glenlivet meant illegal whiskey from what we would now call Speyside. And then all the Speyside distilleries, when they became legit, started calling themselves Glenlivet. And then eventually, you know, Glenlivet trademarked the name, and now we had to come up with a different term. People said Speyside, but again, like the closest Ireland ever came to having a Glenlivet type fascination was Inishowen. In the same way that, you know, people who were nowhere near Inishowen, you know, if you made malt whiskey in Derry, you would call it Inishowen. If you made, you know, Coleraine called its whiskey Inishowen. So again, seems to have been this, you know, had Irish whiskey worked out differently, you know, we've never had.
Oh, we might have lost him.
You can't leave us on that cliff.
Arbitrarily telling people what to do.
Had
things worked out that way, you know.
We lost you. We lost you on a cliffhanger there.
Oh, sensitive, it's a deep state, you know, pulling me out. But yeah, had Ireland had whiskey regions, you would have had Dublin as capital of pot still in a big way, and then the Midlands pot still, and, you know, reaching down into Cork pot still, and then Ulster as rural Ulster as malt whiskey, and then Belfast as grain whiskey. Was about as close as we seem to have gotten to having regions. Late game, there was a little malt whiskey kicking around in Cork, but that just seems to have been a niche industry. It was a group called Glen Distillery who set up to do something, but that was not, you know, it didn't have a whole lot of precedent. But anyway, it was fascinating to see that, like, if we're being candidly honest with ourselves, malt whiskey, excluding the contemporary industry, actually has a very, very, very small percentage, even when we weren't running column stills. But when it was made, what was made was peated, was smoked, and again made largely in Ulster, and drunk in Ulster and Connacht. There was a market for it in Connacht, despite that there was, you know, very few legal distilleries, and those that were in Connacht mostly didn't qualify for the malt drawbacks anyway. But probably via proxy of poaching, there was a market for it in Connacht when it was made.
Now, I do want to keep in mind that we do have other topics to get onto as well. But one of the things you're saying, like, people, you know, if we're being honest with ourselves, people aren't thinking of peated whiskey in terms of malt. But also a lot of, in your findings, you've been discovering that there's a lot more cask variations in use in Ireland than I suppose we would believe currently. I know you're talking about some rum casks, and one thing in particular I was really interested in was port pipes with rum cask heads. Some dealers and some chestnut barrels with vermouth floating around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I sent you on that, Matty. It was a record found in the Locks Distillery archives, which belonged to the National Library. It was actually, there's a whole bunch of stuff from Tullamore in there. I have no idea how it got in there. But it's just floating around in the middle of like a portfolio of Locks stuff, which is great. But it had receipts from B. Daly for casks, and also price offers from cask importers. And they were saying, okay, here's what we'll offer you. Sherry butt, sherry hogshead, this. Sherry is the most expensive, port just after that. And then you scroll down. And by the way, again, if we're not romantic with ourselves, chestnut was cheap. The chestnut is at the very bottom, meaning, this is the transport cask that nobody cared about. But you get all sorts of weird offers along with that, where they're, and half the time they're sending these and bragging that they've scraped them clean in the first place. So how much influence is coming in the first place is debatable. But they don't scrape everything. Yeah, absolutely. So they keep bragging with some of them. This is like new wood. So you find things like vermouth coming in. You think, Jesus, this is going to taste awful. But the big ones, sherry, port, and then rum, and you get like rum heads, things put back together again. Rum, I mean, again, while we're having the malt conversation, we can have the really sober conversation that rum outsold whiskey in Ireland until the 1750s. We were drinking shed loads of rum. Whiskey hadn't industrialized. Whiskey was very, very late to industrialize in comparison to, say, rum, which of course was, rum has a very complicated history with colonial plantations and whatnot, but was coming back in sheds. Brandy commercialized long before whiskey, if only because it was like the packaged raisin of selling wine, and it worked for transport very, very well, whereas nobody was selling whiskey internationally early on. So whiskey only becomes the main spirit consumed, legal whiskey anyway, in Ireland in the second half of the 1700s. And you see a lot of stuff that we could never call anything being distilled. So, there had to be a law to tell people they couldn't run sugar and grain at the same time. What do you call malt and sugar mixed together, malt and molasses mixed together and run and then warehoused? So again, a lot of those casks were floating around as well. So it's a more muddied picture than we often get. Bourbon barrels didn't really exist before World War II in Ireland, any sort of critical mass. But it wasn't as simple as just being sherry barrels either. And there's a lot of barrels just made and then recycled into the system, even with the whiskey itself. But yeah, in the early half of the 20th century, when we start seeing, just before the industry falls apart, we see some really complex stuff with sherry and port, and port with rum heads and things like this, which would be really cool to see again if anyone's listening. Hint, hint.
Well, Fionnán,
around, yeah, I'm sure it could happen.
Exactly. I know a few cooperages that might be able to put some stuff together. Well, Fionnán, I think unless Conor has any questions, I'm going to thank you for your time, because we do need to keep going on some other topics, but perhaps a whole podcast or Facebook Live could be devoted just to findings of your PhD. And I see Dennis in the Netherlands he wants a new book about this, Fionnán. But fear not, Dennis. Fionnán is literally doing a PhD on this topic, so you'll be able to read all.
Oh, well.
Sorry, Fionnán, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Footnotes included, light reading.
Well, Fionnán, thank you so much for your time. I very much appreciate you coming on. Well, I think, Fionnán, if we say goodbye to you, I think, Conor, I think that's a great way to segue at that point talking about so much peated whiskey, that one of the things we have in our glasses tonight, or I suppose doesn't have the resounding crack of an opening bottle, so that a wee screw cap will do. But some Dingle peated single malt new make, which just in itself is fascinating. I for a long time thought that that peated single malt was exclusively off the cards for Dingle. So obviously Graham Cool, master distiller there, coming from Glenmurray.
Absolutely. Having his say.
So he clearly got his foot in the door with the peat. They apparently did. Did you read up on this one as well? They did a week's run of it.
I did not read up on it. I just went purely for the tasting. 65% new.
Incredibly drinkable at 65%.
Absolutely gorgeous. And did you say it was 60 parts per million going in?
Yeah, 60
people are going to ask.
Yeah, 60 ppm going in, and about 20 ppm after distillation. But it's double distilled. Everything, obviously being manual down in Dingle, you can rip a pipe and put on a hose, and you can skip stills and receivers where you need to. But where it is, obviously a confined space of the distillery. A few of the distillery workers supposedly, I'm going to asterisk the supposedly part, had to ditch and burn some clothes afterwards because the peat just wouldn't leave them at all. So it's a confined space.
There's such a fresh, there's your campfire notes along with your controlled sweeter peated notes along with your lovely sweet malts. I can't wait to see how this is going to turn out in wood.
Yeah, for me, I agree with all of those. It's quite a herbal peat. It doesn't have quite the medicinal, like iodine style peating that you get from some other the scotches and whatnot. But I actually get kind of almost like a sweet, crispy bacon in the background as well.
They're very crispy bacon.
This is cool. I like this a lot, and it's very drinkable. And it's almost more pungently peated on the nose than on the palate. The palate is quite balanced, which I quite like. This is going to be quite something else.
Yeah, on the palate, it's very sweet. Lovely mouthfeel to it. Quite coating, and then the smoke wafts around at the back rather than being completely in your face.
Yeah. I'm amazed by the kind of sweetness to it. It almost tastes like. Now, I haven't looked up or spoken to the guys in Dingle to what was distilled, but it almost tastes like there was like almost roasted malts in there as well to get that kind of that sweet, like kind of caramel sweetness out of the grains. Yeah, this is definitely something very interesting, and I didn't think we'd see in Dingle, so I'm quite impressed with this.
Beautiful spirit. Lovely balance, lovely smoke control, lovely balance, love sweetness. Great.
Wildly impressed how drinkable this is. This drinks like it's 46%. Like if you blindfolded me and told me this was between 40 and 50, I'd totally believe you.
Absolutely. Absolutely palatable as it is.
We have some people dropping in and say hi. Mark Freeman over in New Jersey says he'd love to be able to try it with us guys. It'll be a few years out, I think, for the peated malts. Then Jeff Humphreys dropping in from Minnesota saying, will it be available stateside? Probably not for a while, Jeff. This hasn't touched a barrel. As you can see, it's just straight new make. So probably maybe, I don't know, 5 years out, 6 years out from seeing a peated single malt coming out of Dingle. Dave Cummins dropping back in from Dingle, saying it's a great sweet taste to it, and even on the nose.
Super. I can't get over how sweet it is. Still balanced with the smoke. It's delicious.
But it's not like sugar sweet or like candy sweet.
Oh God,
and that's one of the things I hate about the English language. The word sweet can mean multitudes of different things. But there's a grain sweetness, but then there's also a almost a smoke sweet. I don't even understand. But there's like kind of two levels of the sweetness in there. And I'm very impressed with this. And
lovely coating viscosity to the palate level as well. It's just lovely lingering in your mouth. Very much looking forward to this. And I'm sure they won't tell us, but very much interested to know what barrels are going to be putting this into afterwards, because that's going to have a big bearing on how this turns out.
I from speaking to a couple of the guys in Dingle previously, and speaking to Graham Cool, I wouldn't be shocked if we saw some fortified wine barrels. But as I said, I don't work there, so I have no idea. And then Kevin just dropping in to ask exactly that: what kind of casting you may get? Probably a multitude. I'd say a week's worth of distillations. You get a couple of casts out of that, so probably a little bit of a control of a bourbon and probably a sherry. And if there's more to go, a few others. But Dave might be able to tell us, or maybe it's a company secret. We're not in the know enough.
He might nip in. Obviously, we know sherry fits like a hand in a glove, but yeah, there are other fortified wines that go exceptionally well with peat, and it'll be very interesting to see, especially since Dingle's approach is always to use component whiskies rather than finishing. So I suppose whatever they commit to at the start, that's what they're going to run with. So I'm excited. What's Dave saying?
In an array of casks.
Very good. Of course.
Yeah.
That's the diplomatic answer.
Exactly, but also makes a lot of sense. So I think we can kind of swiftly move on a little bit. Some interesting news. The Maison de Whisky, the original Redbreast 15, according to La Maison de Whisky in Paris, they released it in 2006. I know Zoltan was on a number of the Irish Whiskey pages earlier saying that his bottles were from 2005. So I'm going to defer to somewhere between 2005 and 2006. But by the sounds of it, La Maison de Whisky have found a pallet or a number of cases somewhere and have put the original bottles, which, by the way, if anyone doesn't know, Redbreast 15 was originally created for La Maison de Whisky as their kind of European distributor for the Redbreast range back in the 2000s. And it is it's kind of more of a spirit-driven expression than the 12, kind of that heavier pot still element, and it was originally a once-off, and it was so popular in La Maison de Whisky, they basically made it a core range item.
No, I was really delighted to see that come back, because it's almost a blast of nostalgia, because the Redbreast 15, as you said, is the OG older brother to the Redbreast 12. Obviously, when Irish Distillery's done an amazing job of keeping Redbreast out at a 12-year-old, bringing out the 15-year-old was a real eye-opener. I suppose really gave Redbreast more attention and more attention that it did deserve. And I remember when I did get to taste the 15-year-old originally. Actually, I think we did it at a Cork Whiskey Society tasting. It had some of the elements of your very older distillate that you would have got from your older pot stills, like things like your menthol and your herbal notes kind of springing through the sweetness and the spices, obviously sherry influenced. But yeah, your more traditional pot still. But I remember a lingering kind of menthol note, and that was always a very signature kind of style of the older Redbreast pot still. So yeah, that was the precursor to all the stuff that's causing the huge panics, the lotteries, the selling of kidneys at the moment to get the recent dream casks. The Redbreast 15 was I suppose the first step on creating the diversity that is the phenomenal Redbreast range today.
Exactly. It's back on sale at the moment for 190 quid. So you can buy the current Redbreast 15 for, I think, I'm not sure, just shy of 100 quid in Ireland. So you can do that. But should you want to have the OG, just shy of 200 will be your price. I'd say it'll go quickly, depending on how many cases they found.
I'd say it's a back of the storeroom job again. I'd say it just turned up because it's kind of random to bring it up all of a sudden. Although if it is a 2000, I mean, it could potentially be a 15-year anniversary if it is a 205 release. But I know teetering between 205 and 206.
Yeah. I was once speaking to Billy Lighton just at an event, and was saying that the 15 is actually my favorite of any of the pot stills. And he said it was funny for him or speak to him on it, because he was saying that it divides people because the 12 and the 15 are almost fraternal twins, in a sense that the 12 is the kind of cask-driven influence and the 15 being the spirit-driven influence. And he said no one ever picks both. It's either your favorite is the 12 or your favorite is the 15, and there's no kind of, it's the Marmite of the group, if that makes sense. So he said the people, if you love the 15, you love it with adoration and all your heart.
I'm a big fan of, when budget allows, 15 would be the option that I would pick in the range.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I suppose a good segue from the Redbreast into the distillers of Middleton. Shock news this week that Brian Nation has
huge news, I suppose, around the distilling world with that.
Exactly. Brian Nation, who joined head distiller, taking over from Barry Crockett in 2013 into 2014, has handed in his notice and is heading off to Minnesota to join a startup, I suppose, Irish style. I don't like using that word, but Irish style distillery in Minnesota. And Kevin O'Gorman, who is formerly master of maturation, I believe that was his title, master of maturation, is now, I suppose, been appointed master of distillation and maturation, which is
he's wearing 2 caps, so his job just got harder.
Exactly. Well, at least he can tell himself what needs to be distilled, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I didn't think we'd be seeing a new head distiller in Middleton for quite a while.
I suppose it's something that we just take for granted out there, because you Barry Crockett in it, and he learned to trade from Max Crockett, and it seemed to be like a lifelong position. I was only just thinking about it when you said it there. I suppose if Brian took over in 2013 and it's now 2020, that's 7 years. That's the sweet spot for traditionally, your Jameson 3-star or your Rose 3-star. The 7 year was your classic pot still maturation. So maybe he just decided 7 years is the magic number for him to try something different. But Brian, always a gent. I remember one of the first Irish Whiskey Awards that you were probably at. I was sitting at a table with a load of Galway lads, Cyril Briscoe and the crew, and some of the lads were looking at me when Brian was doing the speech, and I was almost translating for them. So I'd love to hear how the Americans are going to get on with Brian's Cork accent. He might come with his own manual. You never know. Exactly.
Dave Cummins saying massive news this week. Wishing them both best in their new roles. Absolutely. I think everyone's excited to see what Brian Nation gets up to in Minnesota. And yeah, I'm sure that.
I mean, Kevin is no old hand at the distillery down below, so I'm sure everything is going to be tickety-boo and in perfect hands, and everything's going to motor along seamlessly.
Exactly. But in fairness, like you said, I think the world just expects the Middleton team to be set in stone and everlasting. You think about it, if you turned around to somebody and said, here, listen, I need you to stay in a job for 7 years. That's a long time doing the same thing in normal terms, So good to see that there. So it's changing things up a little bit, and he's got some new adventures. He's going to actually start up a distillery, I suppose. I think it'll be his first time, because I think Brian Nation started as an engineer in the Middleton distillery. And I think he started when it was changing over from, I remember he was telling me some projects. He was changing over from old Middleton to new Middleton. And he, I don't know if I might have told this story before, and I don't know how much he loves this story, but he told us jokingly at an awards that one of the first things he did, he was told to move pipes, and he didn't know much about the ins and outs of distillation at the time. So one of the pipes led to the spirit safe, and he needed to get into the spirit safe to unbolt something. So he just cut the locks off the spirit safe and started fidgeting around inside. And he said, I don't know if it was Barry or Max Crock at the time, one of them grabbed him and marched him down to the revenue officer's office and said it was him. He did it. We didn't do it. He did it.
I'll be delighted to see another Cork flag parked in a distillery somewhere way out in the USA.
Exactly.
We're all for spreading the good word of Cork.
And the good word of Potstilled, of course.
Of course.
Interesting question. Your thoughts on this? Frenchie and Brian Holland wants to know: will Brian Nation Legacy? Will they do a bottling for him? Do you think?
There's powers beyond ourselves that will decide those kind of things.
Yeah.
You can speculate all day long and you'll never get it right.
Exactly. Jeff Humphreys dropping back in again, saying he'll love his first winter here. And Jeff Humphreys lives up in Austin, Minnesota, so about an hour south of Minneapolis, I believe. And him being an Arizona man, I think he's had a shock winters. It's been 6 to 8 months under snow up there, so it'll be a little different. One for Jeff and his Arizona blood, but for Brian Nation's Corkonian blood, it'll be an interesting transition. But we'll keep moving along. We have, I suppose, a few things we wanted to talk about, but keeping it Munster for the moment. Now, this, just to be, I suppose, wholly correct.
You are Taoscán. That's your. I just see it on the screen. They don't call it that. That's you perpetuating your wording, by the way. I just want to point that out.
That was exactly what I was going to say. It's actually called Dick Mack's.
That's not what Dick Mack's is.
No,
banner under.
It's Dick Mack's drinks by the Dram that I have renamed Tipples by the Taoscán, but perhaps for
talking to people, I love to say to go for a ball of malt. I mean, if you look up the Oxford reference on ball of malt, it means an unspecified measure of Irish whiskey. That's the best kind of measure that I like to drink.
And unspecified. Well, I have changed it now. This is what Dick Mack said. That is what it's under.
Great initiative by the guys under. They have a stunning collection, of course, as we know. And I think the premise of it is they're offering 50 ml samples for the same price that you would have got a 35 ml. So you can actually get, with a 50 ml, there's enough there to share. So you can split the cost of your high level whiskies and get to experience it with a friend of yours, if you're allowed to meet up with them, whatever the regs are at the time.
Yeah, and as you said, I think they said they have like 280 bottles. Excuse me, that are open, and they're literally selling.
Definitely a great initiative from a great place with a great selection. So I think I saw the first thing straight away people were asking for was, is there any of the seaweed cask? Right?
Oh yeah,
something like straight away people were like going, rather serious IPA. But I'm sure they'll get around to that as well.
Well, it's up there. I think that was the idea, was they had a number of those bottles for the bar itself, and obviously the bar's not open. So they wanted to release and if anyone was watching a couple of episodes back on this, we were talking about the Writer's Tears, Dick Mack's collaboration on the Seaweed Cask IPA. And that, I think, is kind of the genesis. But they've got everything up there. They have the 21C vattings from Whiskey Live. They have there's some Middletons. They have some really cool American whiskeys, stuff from like Charleston in there. They've got some great. They've got the Dingles. They've got Hinch. They've got a little bit of everything in there, which is quite cool and pretty reasonable prices.
Check out.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this is something we did want to talk about. Father's Day is coming up. And every year I get inundated with people from all over the world wanting to talk about Father's Day gifts. And we talked about this earlier, Conor, off screen. What say you to those who want just a bottle name shouted at them from the ether?
I'm not going to shout any bottle names. You said this to me. You said, Conor, what would you recommend? I goes, I couldn't recommend anything, because basically, I think for Father's Day, when someone isn't buying a bottle for themselves, get them something that they don't have. Get them something they wouldn't buy for themselves. Get them to look into something else. Because if they're a whiskey drinker, they're going to appreciate all whiskies, all ages. From, I mean, obviously keep it Irish. But what I'd recommend to someone is have a look at the collection, or take a photo. If you're not au fait with whiskey yourself, take a photograph of a few bottles that the father in your life likes. Go to your nearest independent or good retailer, whiskey retailer. Say, look, this is what my dad drinks. I want to get him something different that he doesn't have. And go in and have a chat with whoever's in your local off license and ask them to recommend something that's on the same flavor vein but something different. That's probably the easiest. That's if it's pure liquid. Obviously, you can buy whiskey gifts. There's from anything from cufflinks, the hip flasks, the socks. You can't go wrong with any of them. If you're a whiskey person, you're going to love anything whiskey related. What have you? That's hilarious. See what I have beside me. I actually, I was going to pull it out in case no one said anything on the screen. But anyway.
Hang on, Conor.
He promised me about 17 times he'd sign me a book, but he hasn't done it yet. But we'll get it done.
So I think that's good advice. It's hard to arbitrarily just suggest things for people without knowing the people whom they're being bought for. But the likes of there's whiskeycraft.ie, lots of whiskey related gifts there. Whiskeygift.ie, which is the site where you can literally build a blend in a bottle. Or I checked out, you can just make a single pot still in a bottle if you want, or a peated malt in a bottle. You just pay the price. But I just thought that was super cool. Very easy to use also. But there's a lot of options. Tua glasses. I know Rosie has some platinum rim Tua glasses coming out with kind of a nice 2-case box in there as well. Yeah, exactly. Then let's see. We could
whiskey, anything whiskey related, or even if you know that they haven't visited a distillery yet. A lot of distilleries, especially now, I mean, they'll all do gift vouchers. Buy them a gift voucher for a distillery and let them have a distillery visit that they haven't partaken in yet. And maybe if you can show a few more shillings on it, they might be able to buy their own gift while they're inside in the shop. But yeah, just have a look around your own local area and see what's available. We're spoiled and blown away by the choice that we have these days in Irish whiskey offerings. So give them something they don't have.
Yeah. 31 active distilleries in the country, you know. So there's lots of options. Dave Cummins drops in to say Irish Malt, a 3 Dram subscription. That's actually a great idea. Now, not coming out till November, but I think it's November, if not a little bit earlier. But at the moment, they do have their first initial offering, which is the 500 Dingle Batch 5 deconstruction kits, which I think is quite cool. So if anyone hasn't seen us before, Irish Malts has a subscription service coming out called 3 Drams, where literally 3 Drams drop onto your doorstep every month. And it's something different every month. But the Dingle guys did a pre I suppose release of 100 boxes of the deconstruction of this beautiful batch 5. So the bourbon cask, the PX cask, and the Madeira cask. Yeah, exactly. Isn't it a good sound?
It's a great sounding bottle.
It is. It's satisfying. But so they had the component whiskies of each in 50 mils in the box, and the first 100 sold out like wildfire. So they're now selling the 500 as just kind of a pre-launch idea, soft launch. So that is going kind of globally. So Jeff or Mark over in the States, or I see we've a couple of lads in from Germany as well. Get looking. There's a good question in here from Kevin in Germany saying what do we call in Irish call drop or a dram? He's more for a drop himself. Now, this is a personal choice. Conor, what do you say then in Cork? Do you say your ball of malt, or do you say I'm Biogeen, or what are you looking for?
The ball of malt for me started when I was like probably too young to be working in a bar, about 14 years old, and it was on, and it was actually the guys who were drinking it were actually referring to, they used to come in and they'd be talking about powers generally, because I was working in kind of just outside Dungarvan, the ring kind of area, because I'm from Ardmore, which is just down the road from that, and people would ask for a half and half, and what they meant is like a half glass of Guinness or a half one, which is like, a half measure, because as you know from the previous measures before, a full measure was 70 or
74.
And then a half was then a half measure. So it wasn't actually a half measure of a measure. It was just the older lads referring to a half measure as being the 35.5. But the ball of malt, I remember there were some guys came in and referred to a whiskey as a ball of malt. And I only had a flashback like years and years and years later about it. And when I Googled it, I realized and looked it up what it was. And I loved the fact that it was an unspecified measure of whiskey. I mean, that's the way you want to go out. You want to go for an unspecified measure of whiskey. But to be fair, the easy word that I do say is, I do say the word drop a lot. We'll go out for a few drops. I do personally say that myself. I don't mean to. I suppose I should put more attention into how we call it. But yeah, when you say that there, I would say we'll go out for a few drops. And that's what I mean, a few whiskies.
Yeah. I'd be a fan. If I'm not saying Taoscán, I'd be a man for a tipple myself. A few tipples, but Taoscán being the word I champion.
You're championing that word, to be fair.
Yeah, well, I just went on about a 1.5 year long crusade to figure out the Irish version of Dram. So I eventually found something that relates. Obviously, much harder and much longer. I don't think it'll take over the States, but I'll keep using it for myself. So I suppose we really only have kind of one topic left, and that is the JJ Curry lock-in blend. So quite cool in my estimation that the world of whiskey has moved online, and the interaction with people has moved so drastically in its efforts. You were watching as well there on, it was a Sunday. What did you think of the idea of the kind of communal blending process?
Well, look, it creates so much excitement. And going back to the first point, before we get on to that, I suppose the way the whiskey community has embraced technology is absolutely incredible. I was doing a tasting a couple of weeks ago, and I remember looking at the week ahead. I was doing a tasting with my other work hat on, and that was on a Tuesday. And literally on the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, there was tastings of biblical proportions going on around the country. And I just love the way that, obviously we're watching the Irish community more, but I don't know if there's another country or another community of whiskey drinker after embracing the technology or looking to stay in contact as much as we have, which is absolutely spectacular. Because obviously we have a lot of superb whiskey societies around the country. And we have a lot of brands that are very active and going out talking to people. And I absolutely love, and I'm very proud as a person in the Irish whiskey industry, to look at what's going on day in the Irish whiskey industry, to see how people are staying relevant with their customers, how drinkers are staying relevant with the brands that are coming out. I was talking to someone lately in the aviators, and just one person, and they were saying how they're trying to get involved as much as they can, so that when the world opens up again and the loops open up again, that they're as in tune as they possibly can be with the flavors, the profiles, the wants, the needs of their customers. So people are using this as a great educational platform, not just to have a bit of a jolly because you can. I love how professional this has all been embraced by everyone, by brands, by customers, just by the whole plethora of people in the industry, which is phenomenal. So what did I take on the JJ lock-in blend? what a fantastic way to raise awareness about the next offering that you want. And what you're doing is letting people, sample your wares beforehand, and then you're creating excitement amongst people. I mean, how many times have you been at a tasting, or maybe you've done a tasting where you might bring out some cask samples, or you might bring out a little bit of this and that, and someone goes, "Oh, please, when are you going to bottle it?" I mean, I think this is the ultimate for people getting gratification for that question at the end of a tasting. They tasted it, and then they literally got to decide which one of the 3 samples were going out to them. So instantaneously, you're on a win-win situation when you bring that bottling out. And it's just another way that we've all kind of, I suppose, embraced what's going on. I mean, the world has kind of stopped around us, but the whiskey community, I think, has actually gotten even a little bit tighter. Actually, not a little bit, a lot tighter. With communicating with each other, with communicating their messages. I think it's just been a great visualization of how an industry has tried to make the best of a very bad situation.
I agree. The whiskey that was chosen for the JJ Blockton blend was so there was the 70% grain and 30% malt, and that grain was 50% 4-year-old and 50% 10-year-old, which I'm pretty sure was the makeup of the Hansen itself. And then the malt was a 14-year-old. Bottled, it's going to be bottled at 46. And they said that it'll be available to purchase from Irish Malts when it does come out. So, I mean, everyone who participated has that email dropped into their email box. Talk about direct to consumer right there.
As soon as it comes out, it's gone.
Yeah, no doubt. We have probably exhausted all of our topics for this evening, and I think as well people's time. So, Conor, I'll raise my Dingle glass to you, to the lovely bottles and people of Dingle Distillery, Dave Cummins, and everyone out there, and Head Distiller Graham Cool for sending us the peated sample.
Very excited peated pot or peated malt. Yeah, exactly.
So I'll say to you, thank you so much for your time. To Fanon, who gave us a great amount of time, and no one knows this, but he is still watching backstage. So I'll say I'll bring him on to say goodbye. Fanon, I'm bringing you on as a.
Still enjoying the back preview from behind the scenes.
I just say thank you very much to all of you lads.
You've got a different look every time I see you these days.
I know it's well, what happened was my hair was getting into my eyes, and I had no idea what I was doing, so I just shaved it off, and I've gone from like prison camp to skinhead to like this, and I'm expecting to kind of climb back to normality, but it was a simple solution to a simple problem. We'll see how it ends up.
Well, to you lads, to Dingle, to everyone watching in, Grode and Kevin and Dave and Jeff and Mark and everyone else. Thanks very much, lads. Gramila Magat and Slán go fóill.
Slán.
Slán.
Right.